July 19th, 1944. A Tiger from Schwer Panzer Abteilung 501 rolled down a narrow road near Saint-Lô in Normandy. The commander scanned the hedgerows through his cupola, confident. His frontal armour measured 100 mm thick. American 75 mm guns couldn't touch him beyond 500 yards. He'd survived 3 previous engagements by letting enemy tanks close before destroying them with his 88 mm gun. Then something impossible happened. A round struck his glacis plate at nearly 2,000 yards range and punched clean through. The Tiger lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from the engine compartment. The crew bailed out in seconds, confused and terrified. They'd been hit from a distance that should have been completely safe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The culprit wasn't a new wonder weapon. It was the 76 mm M1 gun, mounted on American M4 Sherman tanks and M10 tank destroyers. On paper, U.S. Army Ordnance had calculated this gun could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armour out to 1,250 meters. German intelligence dismissed those claims as propaganda. The Tiger's face-hardened steel, they believed, would defeat any 76 mm projectile at combat ranges. Both sides were wrong, but for reasons nobody understood until tanks started burning. The story of why this happened involves a metallurgical phenomenon so counterintuitive that it confused engineers on both sides of the Atlantic. Sometimes, incredibly, armour-piercing rounds with more than enough velocity to penetrate would simply shatter against the target. Other times, the same rounds moving slower would punch through successfully. Understanding this requires going back to 1942, when American ordnance engineers first started developing the Colt 76 mm gun. The United States needed a weapon that could defeat German heavy armour, particularly the new Tiger tank intelligence reports described emerging in Tunisia. The existing 75 mm gun on the M4 Sherman was adequate against Panzer IIIs and IVs, but completely inadequate against 100 mm of frontal armour. The 76 mm M1 represented a logical evolution. It fired a heavier projectile at higher velocity than the 75. The M62 APCBC, that's armour-piercing capped ballistic capped round, weighed 6.3 pounds and left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. The math looked solid. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. More mass, more speed, equals more penetrating power. Testing at Ardennes Proving Ground in Maryland during 1943 confirmed the calculations. Against a vertical armour plate at 0 degrees obliquity, the M62 round penetrated 109 mm at 1,000 meters. The Tiger's frontal armour measured 100 mm, sloped at roughly 10 degrees from vertical. Theoretically, the 76 should defeat it handily out to 1,200 yards or more. The gun entered production in August 1943. By April 1944, limited numbers of 76 mm armed Shermans were arriving in Britain ahead of the Normandy invasion. Tank battalion commanders remained sceptical. The 76's high-explosive shell contained only 0.86 pounds of TNT, compared to 1.47 pounds in the 75 mm round. For infantry support work, which American doctrine emphasized, the 75 looked superior. But the real justification for the 76 was anti-tank capability, and on that metric, Ordnance Department projections showed decisive advantages. At 1,000 yards, the 76 could penetrate roughly 37 more millimeters of the armour than the 75. That difference meant the ability to engage Tigers and Panthers frontally, instead of requiring dangerous flanking manoeuvres. Or so everyone thought. The first 76 mm Shermans saw combat in Normandy in late June 1944. By mid-July, after action reports were flooding back to division headquarters with disturbing accounts, crews reported firing at Panthers and Tigers at ranges where penetration should have been guaranteed, only to watch rounds bounce off or fragment against the armor. Multiple hits at 500 yards, 600 yards, even closer, with no effect. At the same time, other crews reported successful penetrations at much longer ranges. A tank destroyer battalion near Carentan knocked out a Tiger at over 1,000 yards. Another Sherman got a frontal kill at 900 yards. The pattern made no sense. Sometimes the 76 worked exactly as predicted. Sometimes it failed completely at ranges where it 2PR should have been devastating. Something was wrong, but nobody could figure out what. The breakthrough came from testing conducted at Ardennes, France, in late July 1944. American and British ordnance officers had access to captured German tanks for live fire experiments. They'd run similar tests before, but this time they varied the testing conditions more carefully. Instead of just measuring penetration at different ranges, they measured what happened at different impact velocities against the same armor. The results were shocking. Against 3 inches of armor angled at 30 degrees, the 76mm M62 round achieved 50% penetration at an impact velocity of 2,069 feet per second. That matched expectations. But then, as they increased the impact velocity, something bizarre happened. Between 2,073 feet per second and 2,376 feet per second, the rounds started failing. Not just failing to penetrate, actively shattering against the plate. Above 2,376 feet per second, penetrations resumed. The armor hadn't changed. The angle hadn't changed. Only the velocity varied, yet there existed a window where higher speed resulted in worse performance. Engineers called this phenomenon the shatter gap. The physics behind the shatter gap involves the relationship between projectile hardness and impact forces. When an armor-piercing round strikes a plate, enormous pressure develops at the nose. The round needs to be hard enough to resist deformation, but not so hard that it becomes brittle. American engineers had designed the M62 round with a nose hardness below 59 on the Rockwell C scale, softer than British ammunition. This softer nose performed well at moderate velocities. The projectile would deform slightly on impact, absorbing some energy while maintaining structural integrity. But at high velocities, the impact forces exceeded what the soft nose could withstand. Instead of pushing through the armor, the nose would fracture, and the round would shatter into fragments. The projectile essentially destroyed itself before it could penetrate. German face-hardened armor made the problem worse. The Tiger's frontal plate wasn't homogeneous steel all the way through. The outer surface underwent special heat treatment that made it incredibly hard and resistant to penetration. Behind that hard face lay softer, more ductile steel that prevented the plate from cracking under impact. This combination of hard face and soft backing was brilliant engineering, but it created the perfect conditions for shatter gap failures. When a 76mm round with a soft nose struck Tiger armor at high velocity, the hard face concentrated all the impact forces on the projectile nose. The soft American steel couldn't resist those forces. The nose would crush, then shatter, sending fragments spraying outward while the main body of the projectile deflected away. The armor remained intact. But here's where it gets truly counterintuitive. At longer ranges, when the round had bled off some velocity through air resistance, impact velocities dropped below the shatter gap threshold. Now the softer nose worked as intended. The round deformed slightly, distributed impact forces more evenly, and successfully penetrated the armor. A slower round, carrying less kinetic energy, achieved what the faster round with more energy could not. The critical velocity range varied depending on the specific armor characteristics and impact angle. Against the Tiger's 100mm frontal plate at slight angles, shatter gap failures occurred roughly between point-blank range and 550 meters. From 550 meters out to 750 meters, penetrations succeeded. This explained the contradictory field reports perfectly. Crews engaging at close range, where conventional wisdom said they should have maximum advantage, were hitting targets in the shatter gap zone, their rounds shattered. Crews engaging at medium to long range, where they expected minimal penetration capability, were achieving successful hits outside the shatter gap window. German tank crews had no idea this phenomenon existed. Their training emphasized keeping distance from enemy armor. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy Shermans at 2,000 meters. Doctrine said to engage at maximum range, use the superior gun to eliminate threats before they could close. But this doctrine, sensible against 75mm armed Shermans, actually helped American 76mm guns defeat Tigers. By maintaining long engagement distances, German commanders were ensuring that American rounds struck with velocities outside the shatter gap zone. If they'd closed to point-blank range instead, most 76mm hits would have shattered harmlessly. The Germans were inadvertently giving American guns their best chance at penetration. The mathematics of the shatter gap created a bizarre tactical situation. The 76mm gun had 3 distinct performance zones against Tiger frontal armor. At very close range, under 300 yards, impact velocities exceeded 2,400 feet per second. Rounds shattered. From 300 yards to 600 yards, velocities remained in the shatter gap range of 2,100 to 2,400 feet per second. Still shattering. But from 600 yards out to roughly 1,200 yards, velocities dropped into the successful penetration zone, roughly 1,800 to 2,100 feet per second. Clean penetrations. Beyond 1,200 yards, the round simply lacked sufficient energy to penetrate, shatter, gap or not. So the effective engagement envelope was a window from 600 to 1,200 yards. Closer than 600, you'd likely fail. Farther than 1,100, you'd definitely fail. Only that middle zone offered reliable kills against Tiger frontal armor. Nobody told the tank crews this. Official penetration tables showed the 76 could penetrate Tiger armor out to 1,250 meters, which was technically true at certain velocities. But they didn't mention the shatter gap failures at shorter ranges. Crews were left to figure out through trial and error that engaging at medium range worked better than point-blank shots. Some crews learned quickly. After several encounters where close-range shots failed, savvy commanders started deliberately holding fire until targets reached 600 to 800 yards. This violated every instinct. You want to shoot as soon as the enemy enters effective range, not let them close further. But empirical experience taught that waiting actually improved hit probability and penetration. Other crews never figured it out. They'd close aggressively, confident that shorter range meant better chance of success, and watch in horror as round after round bounced off or shattered against Tiger armor. Then the 88 would return fire, and the engagement ended badly for the Sherman. The worst part was the randomness. Shatter gap didn't guarantee failure, it just made failure much more likely. Some rounds would penetrate even at high velocities, depending on exactly where they struck, the precise hardness of that section of armor, and minor variations in the projectile itself. This meant crews might get a successful penetration at 400 yards during one engagement, then fail repeatedly at the same range during the next fight. The inconsistency was maddening. British ordnance officers recognized the shatter gap problem earlier than the Americans. They encountered similar issues with their 2-pounder anti-tank guns in North Africa during 1940 to 41. British rounds, despite having harder noses than American ammunition, still experienced mysterious failures at certain ranges. Extensive testing revealed the shatter gap phenomenon, though they didn't fully understand the physics at the time. The British solution was to harden their armor-piercing shot even further. By 1943, British 17-pounder ammunition had nose hardness exceeding 60 Rockwell C. This harder steel could withstand higher impact forces without shattering. The 17-pounder experienced far fewer shatter gap failures than the American 76mm gun, though it wasn't completely immune. American ordnance knew about British testing results but dismissed the hardness recommendations. U.S. Metallurgists worried that extremely hard projectiles would be too brittle. They might not shatter on impact, but they could crack during manufacturing, storage, or handling. The softer nose design seemed like a reasonable compromise, optimizing for reliability over maximum penetration. That compromise cost American tank crews dearly. In Normandy, General Omar Bradley's memoirs record a tense conversation with General Dwight Eisenhower in July 1944. Bradley recalls Eisenhower saying, "Ordnance told me this 76mm would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." The frustration was palpable. The whole point of the 76mm gun was to give American armor a fighting chance against Tigers and Panthers. The immediate solution was ammunition rationing and fire discipline. Division headquarters issued guidance to engage German heavy armor at medium ranges, roughly 600 to 1,000 yards when possible. Crews were told to avoid point-blank engagements. If a Tiger closed to under 400 yards, doctrine recommended disengaging if terrain allowed, or maneuvering for flank shots where side armor was thinner and less prone to shatter gap effects. This tactical guidance helped somewhat. Units that followed it reported improved kill rates against Panthers and Tigers. But the fundamental problem remained. The M62 APCBC round simply wasn't optimized for the enemy armor it would encounter. The longer-term solution was the M93 HVAP round. HVAP stood for High Velocity Armor Piercing. This was an armor-piercing composite rigid design, where a tungsten carbide core sat inside a lighter aluminum body. The reduced overall weight allowed for much higher muzzle velocities, up to 3,400 feet per second. That's 800 feet per second faster than the M62. Higher velocity meant more kinetic energy at the target, even accounting for the lighter weight. At 1,000 meters, the M93 could penetrate 178 millimeters of armor, roughly 60% more than the M62. Against Tiger frontal armor, the HVAP round was devastating at any combat range. The tungsten core was also much harder than the steel in the M62, which meant it could better resist the impact forces that caused shatter gap failures. But there was a catch. Tungsten was scarce. The United States used tungsten for armor-piercing ammunition, cutting tools, and various industrial applications. There simply wasn't enough to produce millions of HVAP rounds. The M93 entered production in mid-1944, but supplies remained severely limited throughout the war. Tank battalions might receive 20 to 30 HVAP rounds per tank, compared to hundreds of standard M62 rounds. Crews were ordered to conserve HVAP for engaging heavy German armor. If you spotted a Tiger or Panther, you could load HVAP. Against Panzer IVs or lighter vehicles, you used standard ammunition. This created a psychological burden. Every time you fired an HVAP round, you were depleting an irreplaceable resource. Miss that shot, and you might not have another when a Tiger appeared around the next hedgerow. Some tank commanders became obsessive about HVAP conservation, refusing to authorize its use unless absolutely compant and necessary. Others burned through their allocation quickly, figuring it was better to destroy enemy armor now than save ammunition for theoretical future engagements. Neither approach was obviously correct. Both involved gambling with your crew's lives. The scarcity also created inequalities between units. Tank destroyer battalions, whose primary mission was killing enemy armor, received larger HVAP allocations than regular tank battalions focused on infantry support. Sherman companies in armored divisions got more than Sherman companies in infantry divisions. Crews in the right unit with the right mission had access to ammunition that could reliably defeat Tigers. Everyone else made do with the M62 and hoped they wouldn't encounter heavy German armor. Supply officers tried to distribute HVAP rounds based on tactical situation and expected enemy composition. Units moving into bocage country where Tigers were known to operate got priority. Units in quiet sectors might not receive any HVAP at all. But German armor moved around. A supposedly quiet sector could suddenly see Tigers transferred in from another front. By the time supply caught up, tanks were burning. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 exposed these problems again. German forces committed substantial armor reserves, including numerous Tiger units, to the offensive. American tank battalions found themselves in desperate close-quarters battles with insufficient HVAP ammunition. Many reverted to firing standard M62 rounds at whatever range engagement occurred, accepting the risk of shatter gap failures because they had no alternative. After-action reports from the Ardennes campaign are filled with accounts of Shermans hitting Tigers multiple times without effect. One company commander reported his platoon fired 1776mm rounds at a single Tiger at ranges between 400 and 600 yards. 16 rounds either bounced off or shattered. The 17th fired at 630 yards as the Tiger was turning to withdraw, penetrated the turret side and killed the tank. 17 rounds, 1 success. That's a 6% hit-to-kill ratio against a single target at moderate range. The engagement consumed most of the platoon's armor-piercing ammunition and took nearly 3 minutes, during which the Tiger destroyed 2 Shermans and damaged a third. This was the reality of fighting German heavy armor with ammunition affected by shatter gap. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German intelligence eventually figured out that American 76mm guns performed inconsistently. Captured technical manuals and interrogation of American tank crews revealed that the 76 was effective at certain ranges and ineffective at others. German tactical bulletins from late 1944 warned Tiger crews that American Shermans with longer barrels, the visual identifier for 76mm guns, could penetrate frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. This was probably the first time German crews took the 76 seriously as a threat. Prior to Normandy, German intelligence assessed the 76 as marginally better than the 75, capable of penetrating Tiger side armor but not the front. The revelation that frontal penetrations were possible forced changes in Tiger employment doctrine. Tigers, operating in France after July 1944, received orders to avoid presenting frontal aspects to 76mm armed Shermans at ranges between 600 and 1,000 meters. If engagement was necessary in that range bracket, crews should angle the hull to increase effective armor thickness or maneuver to present the front at very close range where, intelligence correctly noted, American guns seemed less effective. This was a remarkable tactical adaptation. The Germans had identified, through combat experience and analysis, that the 76mm gun had a specific, effective range window. They couldn't explain why. Shatter gap theory wasn't understood by anyone in real time, but they recognized the pattern. German doctrine evolved to exploit American weaknesses, just as American doctrine evolved to avoid German strengths. The cat-and-mouse game intensified as both sides learned. American crews started using terrain to force engagements at medium range. A Sherman platoon would position itself 600 to 800 yards from a crossroads or valley entrance, wait for German armor to appear, and engage while the target was in the optimum penetration range. German crews learned to recognize these ambush positions and either avoid them or suppress them with artillery before advancing. Urban combat created different dynamics. In towns and villages, engagement ranges dropped to 200 yards or less. At these distances, the 76mm gun struggled with shatter gap against frontal armor, but worked well against Tiger side armor, which was only 80mm thick. American infantry learned to work with armor, using bazookas and rifles to suppress German tank commanders and button up Tigers, while Shermans maneuvered for flank shots. One particularly effective tactic emerged in the fighting around Aachen in October 1944. Infantry would identify Tiger positions and call in artillery smoke rounds to obscure the German vehicle's vision. While the Tiger was blind, Shermans would reposition to flanking positions. When the smoke cleared, the Tiger would be taking fire from the side at close range, where even M62 rounds penetrated reliably. This combined arms approach mitigated the 76's technical limitations, but it required coordination, communication, and experienced crews. Fresh replacement units arriving in theatre didn't have the institutional tape, knowledge built up through hard combat. They'd engage Tigers frontally at close range, experience shatter gap failures, and take casualties before learning the lessons earlier units had paid for in blood. The problem wasn't just technical, it was educational and institutional. The US Army needed a way to rapidly transfer tactical knowledge from experienced units to replacements. Some divisions created informal training schools in rear areas, where veteran crews would brief new arrivals on Tiger engagement tactics. But there was never enough time. The front line always needed more tanks, more crews, immediately. By early 1945, American ordnance had developed an improved M62 round with harder nose steel. This reduced but didn't eliminate shatter gap effects. Production began in March, but quantities remained limited through the end of the war in Europe. Most crews still relied on the original M62 with all its quirks and limitations. The arrival of the M26 Pershing Heavy tank in February 1945 offered another solution. The Pershing mounted a 90mm gun that fired much heavier projectiles at higher velocities. Against Tiger armor, the 90mm experienced minimal shatter gap issues due to its greater projectile mass and improved ammunition design. But only 20 Pershings reached combat before Germany surrendered. The vast majority of American armor remained M4 Shermans with 76mm guns. Soviet forces faced similar challenges with their 85mm guns on the T-3485 and Su-85. Soviet armor-piercing ammunition also used relatively soft nose steel and experienced shatter gap failures against German armor. But the Soviets had different tactical priorities. They emphasized overwhelming numbers and aggressive close assault. If one T-34 failed to penetrate, 3 more were attacking from different angles. The Americans couldn't match Soviet production numbers. They needed their armor to be effective on a per-tank basis. The 76mm gun, with its shatter gap problems, created tactical dilemmas that numerical superiority couldn't solve. You can't mass 40 Shermans in a Norman. The shatter gap phenomenon revealed a fundamental truth about armored warfare that military planners had overlooked. The battle wasn't just between tanks. It was between competing metallurgical philosophies. Every armor-piercing round represented dozens of decisions about hardness, ductility, heat treatment, and manufacturing tolerances. Every armor plate embodied different theories about how steel should respond to impact. When these philosophies collided at 2,000 feet per second, the results often defied prediction. American metallurgists at the Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts spent the autumn of 1944 trying to understand why their carefully designed M62 projectiles were failing. They had access to captured German armor samples, firing test data from Europe, and increasingly desperate cables from field commanders demanding solutions. What they discovered was that armor penetration involved far more variables than the simple kinetic energy equation suggested. The M62 round's soft nose, designed to prevent brittleness, was only part of the problem. The projectile's internal structure mattered just as much. American rounds used a homogeneous steel body with a ballistic cap and armor-piercing cap. The armor-piercing cap was meant to bite into the target plate and prevent deflection. Behind that sat the main penetrator body, and at the very rear, a tracer element and base plug. When the M62 struck Tiger armor at high velocity within the shatter gap zone, the sequence of failure was brutally quick. The armor-piercing cap would contact the hard face of the German plate and begin to deform. In the next microsecond, impact forces would transmit through the cap into the softer nose of the main penetrator. The nose couldn't resist these forces. It would mushroom violently, then fracture. Once the nose fractured, the structural integrity of the entire projectile collapsed. The body would break into large fragments that scattered away from the impact point, carrying most of the round's kinetic energy with them uselessly. The German plate, meanwhile, would show only a shallow crater and some spalling on the rear surface. The hard face had done its job perfectly, concentrating impact forces on the weakest part of the enemy projectile. German metallurgists had developed face-hardening techniques specifically to defeat armor-piercing shot. They understood, perhaps better than anyone else in 1944, that armor protection wasn't just about thickness. It was about creating conditions that destroyed enemy projectiles before they could penetrate. This German expertise came from years of testing and combat experience on the Eastern Front. Soviet armor-piercing ammunition in 1941 and early 1942 had been poorly designed, with inconsistent heat, treatment and quality control issues. German armor defeated Soviet rounds far more effectively than the thickness alone suggested. This success reinforced German confidence in face-hardening techniques, but it also created a blind spot. German engineers assumed all Allied ammunition would have similar weaknesses. They didn't anticipate that the British would respond by making their projectiles harder, or that the Americans would eventually do the same. The face hardening that worked so well against Soviet rounds in 1942 created the perfect conditions for shatter gap failures, which paradoxically meant that at certain ranges, even inferior American ammunition could penetrate. In September 1944, a joint American-British testing program at the Bourget Proving Ground in France conducted what would become the most comprehensive study of armor penetration yet undertaken. They had access to captured German tanks, including 2 Tigers and a Panzer, plus thousands of rounds of Allied ammunition from different production lots. The testing protocol was exhaustive. For each ammunition type, they fired at ranges from point-blank to 2,000 yards in 100-yard increments. They varied the impact angle from perpendicular to 60 degrees obliquity. They tested against German face-hardened armor, homogeneous armor, and several experimental armor types. Each shot was photographed with high-speed cameras, and the projectile fragments were recovered and analyzed. What emerged was a detailed map of how different variables interacted. The shatter gap wasn't a single velocity range. It shifted based on impact angle, armor hardness, projectile temperature, and even which factory had manufactured the round. Some production lots of M62 ammunition showed shatter gap effects starting at 2,150 feet per second. Others didn't fail until velocities exceeded 2,250 feet per second. This variation meant that even with perfect range estimation, a crew couldn't be certain whether their round would penetrate or shatter. The most disturbing finding was that projectile quality control issues at American manufacturing plants were making the shatter gap worse. Rounds that should have been identical showed significant variation in nose hardness. The specifications called for 54 to 59 on the Rockwell C scale, but actual production rounds measured anywhere from 48 to 63. The softer rounds failed more frequently. The harder rounds performed better, but there was no way for tank crews to know which type they had loaded. British observers at Bourges noted that their own 17-pounder ammunition showed much tighter manufacturing tolerances. British projectiles clustered between 60 to 64 Rockwell C with minimal variation. This consistency, combined with the harder base material, meant British guns experienced shatter gap failures, perhaps 15% as often as American 76mm guns. The Americans had sacrificed performance for ease of manufacturing, and their tank crews paid the price. The Bourges testing also revealed something unexpected about German armor. The face hardening process wasn't uniform across the entire plate. Areas near welds, edges, or bolt holes often had different hardness characteristics than the main plate surface. A round that shattered when striking the center of a Tiger's glacis plate might penetrate successfully if it hit 6 inches to the left, simply because that section of armor had slightly different metallurgical properties. This variability explained some of the seemingly random success and failure patterns crews reported. The target wasn't just a Tiger, it was a specific Tiger with unique manufacturing characteristics, being hit at a specific point on a specific plate. Two engagements at identical ranges with identical ammunition might produce different results because the rounds struck different parts of the armor. While metallurgists struggled to fix the M62 round, American industry faced a different crisis: tungsten supply. The M93 HVAP round was undeniably superior to standard ammunition, but producing it required tungsten carbide cores. By late 1944, tungsten demand far exceeded supply. The United States imported most of its tungsten from China, Bolivia, and Portugal. Chinese supply routes through Burma were disrupted by Japanese military operations. Bolivian mines couldn't expand production quickly enough. Portuguese tungsten was partially diverted to Germany through Spanish intermediaries, despite nominal Allied embargoes. The result was a severe shortage that forced painful allocation decisions. The War Production Board created a priority system for tungsten allocation. Strategic bombing of Germany was first priority. Machine tools needed tungsten carbide cutting edges to manufacture aircraft engines. Second priority went to submarine-launched torpedoes, which used tungsten components in their guidance systems. Tank ammunition was third priority, competing with dozens of other military applications. Within the tank ammunition category, further subdivisions existed. Tank destroyer units received the largest HVAP allocations because their primary mission was killing enemy armor. Armored divisions came second. Infantry division tank companies came third. Separate tank battalions attached to infantry divisions often came last. This created bizarre situations where two American tank units could be fighting in adjacent sectors with radically different capabilities. One particularly egregious example occurred during the fighting around Metz in October 1944. The 6th Armoured Division received a shipment of 2,400 rounds of M93 HVAP ammunition. 10 miles away, the 735th Tank Battalion, supporting the 5th Infantry Division, had received exactly 0 HVAP rounds since arriving in France in July. Both units faced the same German armour. Both were engaged in offensive operations, but the institutional priority system meant one unit had ammunition that could reliably kill Tigers, while the other did not. Individual tank commanders became obsessed with HVAP conservation. Some kept detailed logs of every round fired, noting the target, range, and result. They would analyze this data to determine optimal engagement parameters. If a target could be destroyed with standard M62 ammunition, even if it took multiple shots, they'd avoid using HVAP. The precious tungsten rounds were saved for situations where nothing else would work, facing a Tiger frontally at medium range, for instance. This created a psychological burden on crew commanders. Every tactical decision involved weighing immediate threats against future possibilities. Fire an HVAP round now to guarantee a kill, or save it and risk multiple M62 shots that might fail and draw return fire. Hold HVAP in reserve for a potential Tiger encounter, or use it to quickly eliminate a Panther that's threatening friendly infantry. Some commanders cracked under this pressure. After action, reports include several incidents where tank commanders froze during engagements, unable to decide whether to authorize HVAP usage. Precious seconds were lost while commanders debated ammunition selection, seconds during which enemy tanks could aim and fire. In at least 3 documented cases, Shermans were destroyed while their commanders hesitated over whether to use HVAP or standard ammunition. The scarcity also created informal trading networks between units. Tank companies with excess HVAP rounds would trade them to other units for supplies, spare parts, or even alcohol and cigarettes. Division supply officers officially frowned on this practice, but generally looked the other way because it meant ammunition got to crews who needed it most. The black market value of a single M93 HVAP round reached absurd heights. One report suggests a 5-round box traded for an entire case of captured German cognac. American tank crews, lacking reliable ammunition, developed increasingly sophisticated tactics to compensate for the 76mm guns' limitations. What emerged was a combined arms doctrine that treated Sherman tanks not as independent weapons systems, but as components of integrated teams. The most effective innovation was the hunter-killer pairing. Two Shermans would work together, with one acting as spotter and the other as shooter. The spotter tank would position itself with good observation but minimal exposure, often hull down behind terrain. When enemy armor appeared, the spotter would identify the target, estimate range, and determine whether conditions favored engagement. If the range fell outside the shatter gap zone, typically 600 to 1,200 yards for Tiger frontal armor, the spotter would direct the shooter tank into a firing position. The shooter would remain concealed until the last moment, then appear, fire multiple rounds rapidly, and immediately displace. The goal was to achieve penetration before the German crew could effectively return fire. This tactic required exceptional coordination and communication. The two tank commanders needed to trust each other completely. The spotter was deliberately exposing himself to enemy observation to give the shooter the best information. The shooter was relying on the spotter's range estimation and target identification to make split-second decisions about when and where to fire. When it worked, the pairing could engage targets that single tanks couldn't reliably kill, but it required experience. New crews lacked the intuitive understanding of ranges and angles that veterans developed. Training in England before the Normandy invasion hadn't prepared crews for the brutal reality of fighting German heavy armour in bocage terrain. The dense hedgerows of Normandy meant engagement ranges were often under 400 yards, firmly in the shatter gap zone for Tiger armour. Crews had to learn through trial and error which positions offered medium-range shots and which forced close-range engagements. Infantry coordination became essential. American rifle companies learned to identify Tiger positions and relay detailed information to supporting armor about enemy location, orientation, and likely movement patterns. Infantry could also assist by suppressing German tank commanders with rifle fire, forcing them to button up and reducing their situational awareness. The most sophisticated tactic involved engineering support. Combat engineers would work at night to prepare engagement positions for the following day's advance. They'd identify locations where terrain naturally created 600 to 1,200-yard firing lanes, then improve those positions with camouflage and prepared routes for rapid displacement. When German armor appeared, American tanks would be waiting in optimal positions with predetermined firing solutions. One engagement near Streetvith in December 1944 showed how effective this approach could be. A company of 76mm armed Shermans, working with an infantry battalion and an engineer company, prepared defensive positions covering the valley approach. When a German armoured column, including 4 Tigers, advanced through the valley, it entered a kill zone carefully designed to force engagements between 700 and 900 yards. The Americans destroyed all 4 Tigers without loss. The German crews never understood why their frontal armour, which should have been invulnerable at those ranges, failed repeatedly. They didn't know about the shatter gap. They didn't realize the Americans had specifically chosen that engagement range because it fell outside the failure zone. The Germans just knew that somehow the supposedly inferior Sherman had killed them. While American crews adapted tactics, intelligence officers worked to understand German armour deployment patterns. If you couldn't reliably penetrate Tigers at all ranges, the next best thing was knowing where Tigers were so you could avoid unfavorable engagements or prepare properly. The Americans developed a sophisticated intelligence picture of German heavy tank battalion movements. They tracked specific units through radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, and aerial reconnaissance. When intelligence indicated a Tiger battalion was moving into a sector, that information went immediately to forward armor units with specific guidance on engagement parameters. These intelligence summaries would note not just that Tigers were present, but their tactical employment. Some German heavy tank battalions operated independently, moving to threatened sectors to conduct counterattacks. Others were integrated into divisions, providing fire support for infantry operations. The independent battalions were more dangerous because they operated unpredictably and often appeared in unexpected locations. American intelligence also tracked ammunition expenditure patterns. By analyzing German radio traffic and interrogating prisoners, they estimated how many rounds each Tiger battalion had available. A Tiger with a full ammunition load of 92 rounds was vastly more dangerous than one running low on AP ammunition. When intelligence suggested a Tiger unit was low on shells, American commanders might authorize more aggressive tactics, accepting the risk of close-range engagements because the German ability to respond effectively was limited. German intelligence conducted a similar analysis of American capabilities. They knew by late 1944 that Shermans with longer barrels, the 76mm gun, posed a serious threat at medium ranges. German tactical bulletins included silhouettes showing the difference between 75mm and 76mm armed Shermans, and recommended priority targeting for the longer-barreled variants. This created a strange dynamic where American crews sometimes preferred to keep older 75mm Shermans in their formations. The 75mm gun was inferior for anti-tank work, but better for infantry support. More importantly, German crews often prioritized 76mm Shermans as threats, firing at them first. By mixing 75mm and 76mm tanks in the same unit, American commanders could confuse German target priority and potentially draw fire away from their most capable anti-tank platforms. By January 1945, American metallurgists had finally developed a solution to the shatter gap problem, a modified M62 round with a harder nose section bonded to a tougher body. The nose hardness increased to 62 to 65 Rockwell C, close to British standards. The body retained slightly softer steel to prevent catastrophic fractures. The bonding process between the hard nose and softer body was carefully controlled to prevent weak points where the projectile might separate on impact. Testing at Ardennes Proving Ground showed dramatic improvements. The modified M62 experienced shatter gap failures only 8% as frequently as the original design. When failures did occur, they happened at much higher velocities above 2,400 feet per second, which corresponded to ranges under 200 yards against Tiger armor. The effective engagement envelope expanded significantly. Crews could now reliably penetrate Tiger frontal armor from 400 yards out to 1,200 yards. But production of the improved round didn't begin until March 1945. Germany surrendered in May. Only a fraction of American armor units received the modified ammunition before the war ended. Most crews fought through the final campaigns with the original M62 and its frustrating limitations. The improved round did see action during the final battles in Germany. Units equipped with it reported much more consistent performance against Tiger and Panther armor. Engagement ranges that previously resulted in frequent shatter gap failures now yielded penetrations. The psychological impact on crews was significant. They finally had confidence that their ammunition would work as designed. If the improved M62 had been available 6 months earlier, during the breakout from Normandy and the autumn campaigns, American armor casualties would likely have been significantly lower. Tank crews wouldn't have needed to develop elaborate tactical workarounds for ammunition deficiencies. The learning curve for replacement crews would have been less steep. Fewer Shermans would have burned because their ammunition failed at the worst possible moment. The story of the 76mm gun and the shatter gap phenomenon is ultimately about the gap between engineering theory and combat reality. On paper, the weapon system worked perfectly. Calculations showed adequate penetration at specified ranges. Testing confirmed those calculations. But testing couldn't replicate the full complexity of combat, the variability in armor hardness, the manufacturing tolerances in ammunition production, the psychological pressure on crews making split-second decisions. The solution required not just better metallurgy, but better understanding of how all the variables interacted. It required feedback loops between field experience and laboratory testing. It required tactical adaptation to compensate for technical limitations. Most importantly, it required time that crews fighting in Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, and the Ardennes didn't have. The American tank crews who fought with 76mm guns in 1944 were, in effect, beta testers for a weapons system that wasn't fully mature. They identified its flaws through the hardest possible method: combat against an experienced enemy. Their experience led to improvements, but those improvements came too late for many. The shatter gap phenomenon killed American tankers who did everything right, who achieved hits at proper ranges, who followed doctrine, who displayed courage under fire, but whose ammunition simply failed them at the worst possible moment. Understanding this history provides perspective on modern weapons development. The temptation is always to field new systems as quickly as possible, to get capability to the front line before the enemy adapts. But complex weapons systems have complex failure modes that often can't be predicted in peacetime testing. The 76mm gun and its ammunition seemed adequate in 1943. It took combat in 1944 to reveal its critical flaw. By then, thousands of tanks had been built, hundreds of thousands of rounds manufactured, and the production pipeline was too massive to change quickly. The lesson isn't that innovation should be slower, but that weapons systems need extensive testing under conditions that replicate combat as closely as possible, and that feedback loops from operational use to engineering improvement need to be as rapid and direct as possible. The improved M62 round existed by January 1945 because metallurgists finally had detailed information about field performance and captured enemy armor to test against. If those feedback loops had been in place 6 months earlier, the shatter gap might have been solved before D-Day. Instead, American tank crews paid in blood for insights that could have been gained through better testing and analysis. The phenomenon of armor-piercing rounds failing at high velocities wasn't unknown. British ordnance had encountered it years earlier, but that knowledge didn't transfer effectively to American designers, or if it did, wasn't taken seriously enough to change ammunition specifications. Organizational and institutional failures compounded the technical ones. In the end, the shatter gap phenomenon demonstrated that in armored warfare, success depends on the complex interaction of metallurgy, tactics, intelligence, logistics, and institutional learning. Superior steel isn't enough if tactical doctrine doesn't account for its limitations. Abundant ammunition doesn't help if it's the wrong type. Intelligence about enemy capabilities means nothing if it doesn't inform weapons development. Every part of the system has to work together, or the weakest link will fail at the worst possible moment when a Tiger tank appears at 600 yards and your crew has perhaps 5 seconds to live. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.